So we'll begin the second half with a reminder that those who want to tweet in questions for our panel, please use the hashtag Big Marijuana. One word. Thank you now to our second panel. Equally distinguished and I think equally provocative. Andrew Friedman is staying with us. John Hudak is my colleague here at Brookings. He's a senior fellow in governance studies and deputy director of the Center for Effective Public Management. He's the author of a whole lot of stuff, including tons and tons of superb work on marijuana, which you'll find on our website. And most recently, The Medical Marijuana Mess, a prescription for fixing a broken policy. Just next to Andrew's left, we have Michael Correa. It's an honor to have him with us. He's the Director of Government Relations for the National Cannabis Industry Association, which is the national trade group for the illicit marijuana industry, and now has almost 1,000 member companies. And finally, at the far end, Jeffrey Zinsmeister, who is Executive Vice President of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, a national group that's become a leading voice in marijuana policy. He's also a senior fellow at the University of Florida's Drug Policy Institute. We'll begin as before. John, if you could give us a summary of our findings.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm on panels often that have to do with this topic, and sometimes you have some great panelists, and sometimes you have some not so great panelists, and I have to say, having seen everyone on this panel speak before, you're in for a treat. I can't say that about necessarily my own performance, but the people up here today are truly top-notch. So if this is your first marijuana panel, they only go downhill from here. So John and I, as he said, penned the second paper we're discussing today, and it focuses around big marijuana. And one of the challenges as we started out in talking about this paper and thinking about this paper and eventually researching it was defining what is big marijuana. Big marijuana is everything, and it's nothing. It's a tagline that gets attached to small firms and big firms and medium-sized firms and different behaviors within the industry. And so the challenge is understanding what it's meant to be. Oftentimes it's discussed as the Philip Morrisization of marijuana. And you could understand, yeah, that's it. Big marijuana equals big tobacco in that sense. That's certainly something no one wants. But big marijuana can be something else. It can be larger firms that are not the size of Philip Morris, that are not the size of some of these large corporate entities and other industries in the United States. So what we set out to do is try to understand not necessarily what that firm might look like, but what are the types of behaviors that you want to avoid. Because at the end of the day, that's the real challenge. If you had a Philip Morris-sized marijuana firm that was behaving in all of the right ways, engaging in none of the bad behaviors that we have seen in tobacco, that we have seen in alcohol, that we have seen in the pharmaceutical or the financial industries, a lot of people wouldn't have much of a problem with it. And so what are some of those in terms of marijuana that we want to avoid? One is antisocial marketing, and that's marketing to children. That's marketing specifically to heavy users by capitalizing on what for them may be an addictive substance or a substance that they are overusing. Those are real challenges. It's something we know happened in tobacco for years, both in terms of marketing, in terms of how the products were made, how they were talked about, how they were researched, how that research was held down or kept private. And so those are the things, that's one area that you want to avoid from a big corporate entity in an industry like this one. Another is regulatory capture. We talked about that on the last panel. Regulatory capture is when the fox is guarding the hen house, when the regulators are getting all of their information from industry and not thinking through what the biases might be about that information. That's something we don't want. We also, in marijuana, understand that there are patient concerns about big marijuana. Will big marijuana emerge from a recreational market and start to crowd out what, among medical marijuana patients, believe are legitimate health concerns, legitimate safety concerns, and serious concerns about access? As Andrew said, in Colorado, medical marijuana is taxed at a much lower rate than recreational marijuana is. In some states, they don't tax it at all. In Connecticut, for instance, Connecticut initially started by having their standard sales tax attached to medical marijuana, and then the legislature said, we don't tax prescriptions, and so if we're going to treat this like medicine, we're going to treat it like other medicines, and they got rid of the taxes entirely. And so there are patients who are concerned that if big marijuana muscles its way into the recreational market, that the carve-outs that patients appreciate right now, they might go away. In addition, big marijuana could also create or push for extraordinarily high barriers to entry, so increasing the barriers to entry in an industry that already has quite high ones. That can cause a crowd-out effect as well, and at the end of the day, you have large firms that just cannot be displaced. So those are the types of things that you try to avoid. And so when we talk about big marijuana, it's seen as bad marijuana. Big equals bad. But the flip side of that is that small and medium equals good. And that's a real problem. There are, in industries across the United States, big corporate actors that are good actors, and there are some that are bad actors. But at the same time, when you look out at the states that have legal marijuana right now, there are a lot of small actors who are bad actors too. Home grows are creating problems in Colorado. There are a lot of good, honest, genuine home growers who are abiding by the rules laid out in the Constitution and in the limited amount of regulation that exists around home grows. But there are bad actors too. There are bad actors among medium-sized firms. And so this idea, as I said, that big is always bad is wrong, and that differently sized is always good is also a real problem. So then John and I explored what are some of the benefits of a big corporatization of marijuana. This is something people tend not to talk about, right? One of them is compliance. Big actors are incentivized to play by the rules because they have a heck of a lot to lose. And in an environment in which regulation is legitimate, and in Colorado it certainly is, if the state shuts down one of the bigger players, there's going to be a lot of people to swoop in and take that business, and they're going to do it. And so because of that, big firms are induced to comply. They're interested in regulation. Bigger firms can also afford larger regulatory departments within those firms, people who are keeping up to date, understanding what's going well, what's changing in the regulatory landscape, what may change in the regulatory landscape. Those are all good things. And attached to that is reputational accountability. The one thing that's very interesting among marijuana consumers in legal states is that they actually have buy-in to good companies who are making a difference in their communities, companies who are playing by the rules. And having talked to a lot of consumers from legal states, they are not interested, or several of them who I've talked to anyways, are not interested in buying from firms that are breaking the rules, that are getting either cited or shut down for short periods of time or longer periods of time. That reputational accountability means a lot. Branding means a lot to a much larger firm in a way it doesn't necessarily to a very small firm. Big marijuana also employs business acumen. Not every marijuana grower in the United States should own a business, and not every businessman should be growing marijuana. But what you see in a big corporate structure is not just someone who used to grow marijuana when they were a kid diving into the corporate world, but people who are bringing minds together, minds that know a lot about growing and minds that know a lot about business. And those are successful models. Not everyone can learn either. I'd argue it's probably a heck of a lot easier to learn the business side than to grow high-quality bud, but people aren't thinking about it in that way, and so you get a lot of marijuana startups that very quickly shut down. And also attached to that is product quality. These firms are able to test in much better ways and absorb the costs of testing of their product to make sure that you know the potency, the strength, whether they have pesticides in them, whether there's black mold or other bacteria. Those are all very important things in terms of growing marijuana that big businesses are better at than small businesses. So we have a couple of recommendations about how we should think about big marijuana, its costs and benefits, and how states should move forward as they're thinking about it. The first is don't talk about corporate structure or industry structure in hyperbolic ways. Don't always compare this demon of big marijuana to Philip Morris, because there are a lot, as I said, there are a lot of firms that don't have to look like Philip Morris that can do all of the things that you're scared of. So talking about it hyperbolically, I think, really misses the point and does a disservice to the discussion. But also, my recommendation for states would be, don't talk about corporate structure or industry structure at all. That's not the point. The point is the outcomes you're interested in. This is a space that very few people think should go unregulated, and frankly, those people are crazy. It's a space that a lot of people want a lot of regulation. A regulatory model in this sense is great, because that's the way states and society can achieve the outcomes that they want from the businesses that they're overseeing. Well, the best way to get the outcomes you want is to think about those outcomes. Don't think about what structure you like the most. Think about whether you want advertising to be available to children or advertising to be available at all. Big and small firms are going to try to advertise to children if left unchecked. So do something about the advertising. And that's the most important takeaway, I think, from our paper, or at least the takeaway that we want the most, is that there are legitimate concerns, legitimate questions about what this industry is going to do to consumers, to society, to public health, to public safety. And so that's the place that regulators can show their best, is to think those issues through, think best about how to avoid them, and to achieve the outcomes that you want. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, John. One other, if I could supplement, another takeaway from our paper is that, read it and see what you think, but we think that both the industry structure and the regulatory structure is more likely to wind up looking like alcohol than tobacco for a whole lot of reasons, and that alcohol is actually a pretty successful market and regulatory model, which isn't to say that it doesn't have flaws, as everything does. Why don't we, should we go down? Andrew, are you ready to be teed up? What's your experience in Colorado with big marijuana, the profit motive, so forth?
Brookings has given me a lot of homework for today. One of the things I forgot to do was come up with 2 introductions on how to do back-to-back panels. But so no, I'm teed up. I'm good. So I don't want to. I don't think I'm being hyperbolic in this moment to say I think this is going to be one of the most important papers for the next 2 years of marijuana debate, and so I congratulate the authors on it because it is both provocative, and I am sure there are a lot of groups that would wholeheartedly disagree with it, but it's very well put together. So I urge everybody to go and read this. And secondly, I hope you're right, because I think there is an inevitability to big marijuana in Colorado. Already seeing the consolidation, marijuana is a commodity crop, and scale matters, and we're starting to see barriers to entry and the ability to be efficient over scale. I think the ways in which we would have to step on that are pretty dramatic in order to stop consolidation. And frankly, I'm not sure government is equipped to stop it. And so everything that we would try, and really everything we kind of have tried till now, you watch how quickly those with good lawyers can get around what you put up. And you end up with things that actually get in the way of your regulators doing the job they're supposed to do in order to try to research complicated financial structures. And so my biggest hope for the paper is that you nailed it, and that these structures will not, or that we can focus on other things other than how big the structures can be. To the point of whether or not we just ignore it altogether and we kind of stay neutral on structure, I'm not sure we can do that, because a lot of these questions, they hit on regulatory authority, they hit on political problems that are going to come our way anyway. So I'll give a couple of examples. The first is vertical integration, which is something we dealt with when we started with marijuana grows on the recreational side, because obviously we have them on medical side. You have to have a patient's recommendations in order to dispense that plant for that patient. But on the recreational side, we didn't know whether or not we needed it, and a lot of people argued that you should allow the free market. You should be able to just grow, or you should be able to just sell. and people argued that if you had vertical integration, only the big guys would succeed. But we started with vertical integration for the very simple fact that we wanted fewer players at the beginning when we rolled out marijuana, and we couldn't overwhelm our systems with background checks. And so it's one of those places where, yeah, it had an impact on barriers to entry. For the first 8 months, we only allowed vertical integration, and then we got to smash vertical integration, which was one of my favorite terms that we've come up with so far. But that wasn't a choice on our part about what we wanted the economic structure to look like. That was a choice on what we thought our regulatory system could handle. So a question that's coming up now is whether or not we need to bring distributorship back into, much like alcohol. Well, in a lot of ways, that is a question about public health, public safety. Would it be better to have a redundant check on a lot of these things, have one more person along the pipeline that has to be responsible for that stuff? But in a lot of ways, that's a question about economic structure and how big or small a single company can get. And then out-of-state investment is the exact same thing. And that one is more of, can we ignore the politics of everybody pounding on our door saying either we want or we don't want out-of-state investment, and where do you guys stand on this? And it also implicates the Cole memo of allowing for to what extent there's interaction with people out of the state. And so all those things mean I'm not sure we have the ability to stay neutral on these things, which is something I would love to dive deeper into. I worry about a lot of the same things. I worry about marketing with big marijuana. I do worry, not that I don't think, marijuana has the same 20/80 problem as pointed out in the paper, that roughly 20% of the users use 80% of the product. You worry that people are going to move towards getting people addicted and getting people addicted younger. And you worry that those who have access to capital know how to do that in a much better way than those that don't have access to capital. That keeps me up at night. But on the other side, I've seen the dangers of having small grows. When we implemented pesticide regulation, I had a woman come into my office crying because her kids were no longer going to be able to go to law school because we caught pesticides on her marijuana. And my heart broke for her because we literally took every dime of her savings away from her. But also, you can't have pesticides on your marijuana. You can't have off-label pesticides on your marijuana. And so that's something that is much easier if you have somebody with the capital to get over new regulatory challenges that won't go out of business every time the wind shifts. And so both heartbreaking, but also a lesson of how hard it is to be a highly regulated business owner when you're dealing with not very much capital. And then the final thing I'll say is there's a lot of talk about lobbying power of the big guys. I will tell you, I've seen lobbying power of the medium and small guys, and it's pretty strong too. And so these guys know how to join industry groups, and their problems are a lot different than the big guys. And one of the things one of my regulators told me, who also regulates casinos, is the big guys don't play small ball, but the medium guys do. And so you're much more likely to get through some of these bumps in the road with, say, again, pesticide regulation with the big guys who will just say, fine, we'll figure it out and we'll get there, than you are with the small guys who say, no, this is going to put me out of business. And so they also know how to lobby, and they also know how to put money behind lobbying, and they go down with a fight. So that's what I got from your paper, so thank you.
That's fantastic. Life sure is interestingly complicated when you actually have to implement these decisions, isn't it? Michael Correa, you must spend 24/7 dealing with issues around big marijuana. What's your perspective on our paper and the whole question?
I have to apologize to the audience that I didn't bring samples, and so we don't have that. Maybe next time we can sponsor. I wanted to thank Brookings and both Jonathan and John for doing this paper. It's a wonderful paper. And like Andrew had mentioned about his mother, now I can say I've spoken at Brookings, and she's going to be very proud of me. I thought the paper was great. My feelings can be summed up on page 2, where it says, intelligently regulated and managed, big marijuana can be part of the solution. And I think that's very important. My view has always been, if you create a proper regulatory structure, you're going to get a good result. Our opponents will say, if you legalize marijuana, people will start consuming marijuana. Newsflash, we're already consuming marijuana. I think half the population, marijuana's been illegal for half a century, and half the population has consumed marijuana, and I think 20 million, almost 20 million have consumed it in the past 2 months. And so just as alcohol consumption didn't drop with prohibition, marijuana consumption didn't drop during the war on drugs. And so it has always been supplied by a black market. And I think the only sensible approach right now is to bring it forward, tax it, and regulate it behind a legal counter, and that's very important. Every fear we have about marijuana can't be addressed in a black market. But you can't control the black market, but you can control a regulated market. Andrew talks about what he's working on in Colorado, but he has that power. In a black market, he doesn't have that power. The drug cartels don't care. They don't card. They don't care about pesticides. They don't care about rules. They don't care about regulations. And that's the world we've lived in for half a century. Some of the highlights of the paper that I just wanted to point out. In our view, any conversation about marijuana policy should not begin with a debate over firm size or corporate structure. Instead, the discussion should focus on types of behaviors, outcomes, situations, and costs that should be encouraged or avoided, and best to generate the incentives to achieve each. That's the most important thing policymakers should be dealing with. This is consumer driven. The big marijuana is not out there pulling strings, forcing people to consume cannabis or smoke marijuana. They're already doing it. What the industry is doing is providing a product that the consumer is already demanding. And that's really important. So I wanted to thank Brookings for at least having this discussion. We need a serious discussion about this to talk about the role industry plays, the role in regulation, the role in taxing. And what I find frustrating about Project SAM is they're not solution oriented. You look at their website, they say they're focused on stopping marijuana legalization, not controlling corporate America or big bad, stopping marijuana legalization. And they said because it has placed corporate profits and addictions ahead of public health. Colorado legalized 2.5 years ago. Where is this big corporate model that's been out there forcing people to take a choice, and we're going to have you smoke marijuana versus public health? And that's sort of a false premise that they've put out there. And I think they've been demonizing the industry like we've been around, like we are big tobacco, and it's just not been the case. And the other thing I wanted to point out was that the previous panel, everything they discussed, whether it was pro or con, still pointed back to the fact that we need a regulated market. Everything has to come back to a regulated market. And so I'd like to be able to answer a lot of questions. I want to keep this brief. And so those are my thoughts on that. So thank you.
Okay, Jeff, you're up. You got teed up a little bit there by your predecessor, but we're saving the best for last. So Jeff Sinsmeister of Project SAM.
Oh, that's all right. We'll have some words from Michael here towards the end of this. Don't worry, we won't leave you out.
This is why they come in such numbers.
That's right. No, we promised entertainment here. Well, first of all, again, I wanted to echo what everybody said here, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. It really is a distinguished panel and two distinguished authors here. I actually going to take the bulk of my time, actually not sort of going, sort of back and forth with Michael, but I do want to comment on the paper itself too, because while I think it's an admirable effort, I do think because the paper doesn't really engage in some meaningful comparative market analyses here, it kind of misses the central point here and some very important facts. I look at this from this perspective too, because before getting involved with smart approaches to marijuana, I worked for Bain & Company as a management consultant. So this is something that is fairly familiar to me. And what I would say just briefly is, if you look at the way that these various industries, tobacco and alcohol and marijuana, are set up and what the cost structure is and how they operate, what you see is two things. I mean, number one is that a very highly concentrated marijuana market is inevitable if it's legalized, and that's really just because of two reasons. I mean, it's because it's a very capital-intensive industry. Instead of being very labor-intensive, it requires a lot of upfront capital, and that makes it very scalable, which basically means that the bigger you are, the more competitive you are, and the lower your costs are going to be, since you divide those big capital costs over a larger and larger amount of product. And that's particularly true with tobacco, which has a very similar production process to marijuana. It's cultivation, you cure the product, it's rolled into joints or it's put into other products, and then it's sent out in distribution channels for retail sale. And alcohol, honestly, works just the same way. I mean, beer and spirits are very highly concentrated, just like tobacco, because they have a very high capital costs, relatively speaking, and they also have they share brand loyalty as a very important dynamic as well. And so, big companies tend to be better at creating brands and making brands stick. Wine, as you notice in the paper, is much less concentrated than those other two segments of the alcohol industry because it is much more labor intensive. And so bigger producers have less of an advantage when it comes to competition. So it's just simple market dynamics. I don't think, when you look at the initial studies that have been done, and there aren't too many of them out there, but the initial studies that have been done about scaling in the marijuana business, as Andrew said, you have huge advantages the bigger you get. The production of marijuana cultivation is a commodity product. The more of it you buy, the better deals you're going to get. And distribution and working with distributors is the same way. The bigger you are, the better deals you're going to get. And that's where I think also the comparison with the argument that a 3-tier regulation model like you see with alcohol is going to somehow break this, it just becomes counterfactual for two reasons. I mean, number one, it didn't break the consolidation of the beer industry. In fact, the beer industry consolidated steadily from Prohibition, the end of Prohibition, until the 80s. And it's only recently have you seen a resurgence of smaller breweries as the 3-tier model has started to break down in certain states, and they've allowed direct sales to consumers, precisely because those distribution channels and those contracts favor large companies that can negotiate better deals and drop costs. So again, if you legalize marijuana, you are going to see the same business dynamics that will force the industry towards consolidation like tobacco. I don't think it really matters how you regulate it, unless, as Andrew mentioned, you have very heavy government regulation that effectively just breaks up large companies. The second point, with some of my remaining time, is I think it's also very difficult to break the market forces that inevitably lead big marijuana to act like big tobacco. Both businesses, the majority, as it's been mentioned several times here, the vast majority of revenues come from a very small percentage of heavy users, and the younger you are, the more likely you are to develop that type of heavy use pattern that boosts revenues. So there's always going to be that profit motive, pushing companies to sell as young as possible and to sell to heavy users. Now, you can say that ethics, we don't think like tobacco executives anymore, but I would challenge people who make that argument to actually go sit and watch shareholder meetings or to meet with executives at large public companies. It's very hard to resist equity holders' pressure not to boost profits as high as possible. And because if they don't like you, if they don't like one management team, they'll just replace you with people who will do what they want. So what we see here is just, it's just sort of an inevitable trend, and that's true with tobacco, and that's actually also true with alcohol to a great degree. I think we see alcohol a little bit differently because it's more socially acceptable. I mean, you can just see that in dating websites. I mean, people will say, "Well, I won't date a smoker," but you rarely see people say that about drinking. I mean, we just see it in a different way. But there is, the alcohol industry consistently refuses to institute moratoriums on advertising. They do target children with their ads. There's plenty of evidence out there to show that happens. So, again, I just think that these business dynamics inevitably push marijuana, just like tobacco, into a model that is constantly going to be pushing the limits when it comes to targeting children and to targeting heavy users. And if you don't have to believe me, I mean, this is sort of my final point on the paper, is that you don't have to believe me. I mean, all you need to do is look at the internal tobacco industry documents that show that they've been studying this market since the late 1960s, and in fact have already acquired intellectual property around cannabis. In some ways, all of this discussion is moot if assuming that marijuana is legalized at the national level, that the tobacco industry simply jumps in and consolidates the industry under its existing brands. And then it literally is big tobacco. And finally, I find this sort of, I mean, I guess I expected from, to be honest, Michael, I expected from a lobbyist this sort of talking points about how we're part of the problem and we're part of the solution. And I take that in the context of, they're paying you to say that, and I get it. This is, you're a lobbyist and you're a paid lobbyist, and that's what you do. But I will say this, and, there's a reason why both former Congressman Patrick Kennedy and David Frum agree on this issue, and, two people from very opposite, very different sides of the political spectrum, and are concerned about the way that this debate is going, and frankly are very concerned about how the industry that you're representing is framing these ballot initiatives that certain states are going to be voted on. And I'll just close with one sort of observation on a number of the ballot initiatives that are up for grabs this year. A number of them, when they constitute they set up these state regulatory panels, they mandate by law that the industry will have seats on them. And in fact, in certain cases like Arizona, it's 3 out of 7. In Massachusetts, it's effectively de facto 9 out of 15. So that, speaking of the fox and the hen house, I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about, and that's before this industry has even had a chance to pick up steam. I mean, the only reason really that the industry is still in its sort of fragmented state as it is today is it's new, and you don't have access to all of those levers of institutional capital like legitimate, legal businesses at the federal level do. If you did, the industry would consolidate very rapidly. Institutional capital would have an even greater role, and we would see a large consolidated national market like we do with alcohol and tobacco. So with those comments, I just want to say thank you again. I appreciate the chance to engage in constructive dialogue on this.
Thank you.
Can I have some fun with that?
Yeah, we'll come back around, but I wanted to thank everyone for some good civil disagreement. We'll give you all a quick second shot for whoever wants it, but we need to get to the audience soon, and I wanted to offer John the opportunity to just make any return comments.
Sure. I will. I'll respond really briefly to 2 points. The first is Andrew's about not being able to avoid thinking about structure, and I think that's an unfortunate political reality that exists, particularly as these initiatives or what will almost certainly soon be legislative actions that legalize marijuana at the state level. Those political negotiations naturally jump towards adjusting market structure, and that's fine, and I completely understand. But what I would argue is to think first, as I said before, about outcomes, and then think about how you can manipulate market structures to achieve those outcomes. So it's not that necessarily states should let markets form themselves as they may, but think about how you can create the sort of avenues to make sure that those structures achieve what you want them to achieve. I guess she's not technically my colleague, but I consider her one, Sarah Trumbull from Third Way. She argues that at the federal level, when the federal government eventually addresses this, they should put in guardrails. And Mark Kleiman makes this argument too, not to hem in the states in a very specific way, but to give them a little bit of latitude, recognizing that each state is going to have its own unique issues or problems or whatever when it comes to this. And I think with industry structure, that's one way of doing it too, making sure that you're not necessarily defining exactly what a structure is because that's the structure you want, but rather to put in this sort of guidance system to make sure that some of these bad actions, and Jeff certainly highlighted a lot of them, are avoided. For Jeff, I couldn't agree more that there's a march toward consolidation. We make the point several times in the paper. Andrew makes the point. I think looking out at it, it's, as you said, certainly a natural process because marijuana is so capital intensive. But I also think it's true because of who's getting into who licensees are. There are a lot of licensees who are jumping into this who have no business trying to open a marijuana business. And so in part of the failure is the capital intensive nature of it, and they're just not funded well enough to do it. But also it's in some cases just a total lack of business acumen. So rather than them closing their doors, they save what they can and agree to be bought out. And so those types of behaviors, I think, are adding to what Jeff is absolutely spot on with about the capital-intensive nature of it. What I will say is the idea that we're moving toward big tobacco-style bad behaviors. There will certainly be people with those motives. There will certainly be motives in general that drive those interests. But I do think that people are very skeptical of those behaviors right now. We know what they look like. In the 1960s, we actually didn't. People weren't comprehending what tobacco companies were doing. People know that now. They're weary of it. And for an industry that people, even supporters of legalization, are highly skeptical of already, I think that skepticism combined with an understanding of what those behaviors look like, what they might look like in public, what they might look like in private, would make reforming those institutions, the industry, the businesses themselves, the regulations, reforming them a much easier sell to the community at large, to the state, to states itself, or to federal legislators, because of the wariness that has existed now for a few decades around tobacco, and the wariness, I think, that exists about the marijuana industry itself.
Let's ask the other three for a lightning round. You'll get 45 seconds each to answer any big outstanding questions, but I'm sure we've got a lot of activity in the audience and only 15 minutes. So just going down the table, Andrew, anything to add?
I've had my opportunity.
Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in your comments, you're indicting capitalism. You're indicting the corporate structure. From a starting point, no one wants kids smoking marijuana, just like we don't want kids drinking alcohol, we don't want kids smoking cigarettes, we don't want kids firing guns, watching porn, hell, even eating junk food. But what do they have in common? They're all legal. And so you control that by education, and that's how you get it down. And so if you applied that standard, we wouldn't have any industry. And you talk about corporation or corporate structure like it's bad, but that's how our entire economy is built. And so I just, that was just my comment on that.
That was exactly 45 seconds. How did you do that? Jeff?
Sure. My only response to that is the difference between this industry and almost every other economic sector in the world is that this is an addictive industry. And it sells a product that's addictive. And so it plays by slightly different rules, and we have to look at it a little bit differently. So, yeah, I mean, the sort of facetious criticisms that sometimes people will bring up is, well, you want to ban sugar, or what about coffee, et cetera. We're talking about marijuana here. We're not talking about those other things. I'm not here to debate those other things. And frankly, that's not, I'm not interested in debating those things because that's not what we do. We're just focused on whether creating a commercialized market for marijuana is a good idea or not. And I would posit that the dynamics of addictive products, when you marry that with industrialization and Madison Avenue type marketing, you get negative results. That's all.
That was 47 seconds. How do you people, you've done a lot of panels over there, haven't you?
All right, I even bring my little stopwatch, to be honest.
Amazing. Well, let's go to the audience. Before we do, I'll use moderator's prerogative just to say when you read these papers, you'll see a couple points that haven't come out in the panel, which I just make in passing or at least alert you to. Our paper doesn't dispute that consolidation will happen in the now extremely fragmented marijuana industry. The question is whether that's a bad thing, and we point out that there are very significant benefits as well as cost to consolidation. Another point we make, which we think is often lost in the shuffle, is that big industry and big regulation are friends, not enemies. So the tobacco industry now is extremely heavily regulated. All the behaviors which you think of as bad, those are basically illegal now. The FDA doesn't allow them. Entry is also very difficult, and size is immense in this industry. If you want big industry, the quickest road to get there is big regulation for the reasons we've been discussing. That's not an argument for or against big. It's just to say this doesn't necessarily cut the way people sometimes assume. So let's go to all of you guys. Okay, no shortage of hands. I'm going to start at the very, very back, again, the gentleman in the yellow shirt. Again, we've got less than 15 minutes and lots of people, so please keep it short and make it a question.
Thanks. Rodrigo Valderrama, Plantation International, and I'm with you on the fact that you shouldn't advertise to kids or all of that. Simple question is, what's the deal on the banking? When is that going to be allowed? And you're basically creating another industry of guards, just not being able to use the banking industry.
I'll certainly let Andrew speak on this, but from my perspective, what's interesting about banking, it's really a challenge for the industry, which all of you who have paid any attention to this knows. From talking to people on Capitol Hill or talking to lobbyists, for instance, this is the one issue that Congress actually sees in a sort of clear-headed way as a major issue. And so I think for a lot of people, whether you're a legalization opponent or supporter, you look at this and recognize it's a pretty serious public safety issue, driving wads of cash around in cars. And so I think for a lot of people, even opponents of marijuana legalization, they look at it and say, listen, if we're going to have this in our state, this is something we can't have. I mean, it's only a matter of time until there's a very serious armed robbery. That's just a reality. But what I will say is, because I've been paying attention so completely to the panel, just as we sat down, I saw on Twitter, the Senate Appropriations Committee actually passed an amendment to a funding bill this afternoon that would grant access to banking in states that have legal marijuana operations. Now, that's just one Senate committee passing that provision, but it goes to show the Senate's actually a lot harder than the House to move things on this. At least historically, that's been the case. And so I think it shows that moving in that direction is going to be the easier sell, because it's not really about marijuana. It's about the safety and security of individuals working in the industry.
Sorry.
Oh.
2 seconds on that one.
Yeah, sure, please.
I'll start with a little good news and then why it's still a problem. The good news is I think we've found some pretty good short-term solutions, and they've generally focused on forgiveness rather than permission from the federal government. We tried permission a couple of times. We tried to pass a brand new financial institution structure called a cannabis co-op. We then tried to charter the first cannabis-only credit union called Fourth Corner. Both of those were rejected by the Federal Reserve. But there are now, 6 to a dozen to maybe even a few more community banks and credit unions that are filling out suspicious activity reports and openly banking marijuana. And I think that's actually been helpful, and we've seen a market uptick in the number of people. Now, I think now instead of having a banking problem, we still have a Visa MasterCard problem, because even though they have banking relationships, they're still doing everything in cash because there are policies at the credit card companies that they don't allow for these transfers. And so that's actually probably the most important one to get online. And the last thing I'll say is banking, until you get to 100% banking, you still have a big problem, which is that you can claim to be this 15% who simply cannot find a banking relationship and then be a money laundering institution and hide in those shadows. And so an 85% fix is a good fix for public safety, but the other reason you want 100% banking is to have legitimate financial oversight. Until you get to 100%, you're not there.
And that is my main focus at the federal level, is educating policymakers about the need to address this issue. I think it's a safety issue, a law enforcement issue, and people shouldn't be carrying around suitcases filled with cash.
I mean, we just see it as, it's not a major focus, but we do see it as a real indicator of the ability to scale, I think, is access to banking and financial markets. So, for those in the industry, if you're interested in sort of knowing when the big competitors are going to really start sprouting up, I think that's going to be a big factor. I mean, we don't support it, obviously. We don't, because we're opposed to legalization and commercialization generally, but it's obviously not something that we have made a centerpiece of what we talk about.
Good, thank you. The banks are filling out suspicious activity reports, filing those, and the federal government is choosing not to enforce. Is that how it works?
Well, the FinCEN guidance that came out, they called the Valentine's Day memos because they came out on Valentine's Day, said that there's basically 3 levels of suspicious activity reports you should fill out if you're banking marijuana. One is this is happening within the regulated industry of that state, and things seem to be going as per the Cole memo. The second being, hey, I think we're seeing something wrong, and the third being a termination memo. They've then said, and if you do that, it might be okay. And so everybody sees it as a giant blinking yellow light, but people are now going forward with that.
Interesting. Gentleman in the back with the blue blazer.
Hi, Robert Kopecki, Marijuana Policy Project. I got a question for Andrew. Jeff brought up the fact that a couple of the ballot measures have regulatory bodies that automatically seat individuals from the marijuana industry on them. I'm curious what Colorado's regulatory board structure was like, and if you had individuals with industry experience, whether that was helpful or whether you found them to be obtrusive towards regulating for public health measures.
So we don't have a regulatory board on the Department of Revenue. We have our state licensing authority, which is Barb Broll, which I think that's pretty cool. She just is the authority. What we had was an advisory group that was very, very influential, and that was our Amendment 64 task force. That really did, it had everybody on it, and that was incredibly important, and it was incredibly transparent. It was probably one of the top 3 smartest things we did while implementing legalization. I will tell you that there has been a couple of efforts by members of industry to create a board for regulatory oversight that would seat people from the industry on it. We were frankly pretty appalled by the first board structures that we saw. It was a legislative push by some members, and something that we saw as bad marijuana. And so we think it's far too early for the roosters to guard the hen house.
Or the foxes, as it were.
Oh, yeah.
The roosters probably do guard the hen house.
Thanks. I think I've said that wrong for now 3 years. So,
we have a hand up here, 4th row back.
Hi, Fernanda Alonso from the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. While I am a big advocate for legalization, I am slightly concerned that you think that big tobacco is something that's improved in recent years. And I think the fact that you have other industries, such as the soda industry, which is an industry that no one rarely talks about, shows that, yeah, they don't do these bad practices that they used to before, but they still make the rules in the game. Like, FDA can now regulate things, but the tobacco industry has put enormous pressure so that they haven't been able to pass taxes or any advertisement regulations since 2009. So my concern, and this is more for John, I guess, is you kind of talk about, well, we should think, is advertising to minors something we want to focus on? Or is this the measure that we want the outcome to be? But if it's the industry that ends up making the rules, how are you making sure that these outcomes are actually going to be put in place?
Well, I think I pretty straightforwardly addressed that regulatory capture is a problem, and it's something that should be avoided. One of the challenges, of course, is when you try to regulate an industry that's already existing based on errors that it is committing. Now, one of the opportunities that exists, at least right now in a lot of spaces, is that marijuana is still illegal, and so as it comes online, and particularly as states learn from other states, they are able to design regulations in ways that are much more effective rather than having to go and re-regulate a tremendous industry with giant corporate players. And so even now, with big marijuana not really in existence in the way that we think of tobacco or pharma, it is going to be easier to do re-regulation now of the marijuana industry as we see these issues pop up, rather than what's going on in tobacco. I mean, but to your first point, I think we make no reference anywhere in the paper that there are not problems in these peer vice industries. But I think anyone who thinks that tobacco is behaving as badly now as it was in the 1960s probably has a pretty rough understanding of what big tobacco was like in the 1960s. They're not angels by any means, but they were a hell of a lot worse 50 years ago. And that's the point we make throughout the paper.
Yeah, I would disagree with your characterization of tobacco regulation. Tobacco is, as far as I know, far and away the most heavily regulated consumer substance, and those industries are very tightly regulated in terms of marketing. I mean, the Marlboro Man, all that stuff. This is long gone. Introduction of new products and so on. So you and I could have a discussion after, but I'd argue that it's maybe there's stuff left to be done there, but this is not the buccaneering big tobacco of yore. At least that would be my view. Let's see, who else?
Can I add just one quick comment? Yeah, I would just say, I agree with that, largely speaking, but I think that there are still areas where we should be careful. I think the e-cigarette industry, which is rapidly developing and actually is an entry point for the tobacco industry into the marijuana markets. And so some of these vaporizing devices have dual uses. I think could be another area where we may see some issues down the road with tobacco.
Yeah, maybe. We'll stay off tobacco though, when we're down to a minute and a half. So let's do the gentleman in the front row who's been very patient.
So first of all, I thought
it's Rick. Sorry, Rick.
Rick Kimmel. I'm on the Brookings board. I thought you guys have done an outstanding job with these couple of papers, and the panels have been outstanding, so thank you so much. So I was interested in the dynamic over here with Michael and Jeff, and I heard some comments about how industry is not yet consolidated in terms of its lobbying efforts, 3 different organizations. It would seem to me that the industry would want to be really ahead of the curve in ensuring good regulation. And then, Jeff, what I heard was sort of, we're out of this whole thing, we're against all of this. Feels to me like it's coming, and how are you coming together with industry to make sure these regulations and the big marijuana or big actors are going to act responsibly?
I think that's very important in that if you really care about this, you should have a seat at the table, and you should be discussing. We know where this is going. We know where this is going to end up. A black market doesn't do anything. I think I mentioned your website. There was another quote where you say you are educating staff about the dangers of legalization. We believe in an approach that neither legalizes nor demonizes marijuana. What is that? And so I would love it. And I just want to say, I think you and I should go on a traveling roadshow, and so we should go around the country, and we could have some fun with that.
You thinking something like dueling pianos or something like that? I got to see where your skills are first before you. I mean, look, this is something that we hear a lot is, well, why don't you just sit down with the industry? I mean, first of all, with all due respect, we in time will prove whether this is correct or not, that we don't see this as necessarily being a foregone conclusion, and particularly we don't see it being a foregone conclusion in the sense that the way that it's developed in the states in this sort of corporate free for all. So, with all due respect, we'll see. I mean, that's a decision we've made, but we feel like that's the right thing to do, and come ask me in 8 months, and maybe we'll see, or 2 years. And secondly, in terms of just working with the industry, I mean, that kind of goes hand in hand, but we just don't think that we are at the point yet where we need to sit down with what we consider to be the next Philip Morris or the next Altria Group and start thinking about how we can best tailor things that they would see as regulations that might best benefit them. So I understand, I understand what lobbyists are here to say, and I understand they get paid to say, and that's fine, but we disagree, and that's just, I think, we'll see what happens in the ballot box.
Last word to Andrew Friedman.
I would just point out that dynamic is actually a little bit frustrating for states that have legalized and are now looking for good governance models, mainly because I think we lack a reasonable anti-side that sits down and helps us craft the best policies going forward. Mainly, again, it's to reiterate the point that we feel like we're a pawn in a chessboard with a lot of these people, and so it is a dynamic I would love to figure out how to flip on its head and get a lot of these people at the table figuring out how to do advertising restrictions with us, and it's a future I'm looking forward to. So thanks for the question.
So that's our next project. Fantastic.
Jonathan, 30 seconds?
All right. Yeah, okay,
I just want to say, Jeff calls me a lobbyist, and I am a lobbyist, and I'm very proud of it. We're on the right side of history, and when Ken Burns does a documentary on this, I'm going to be front and center, so thank you.
All right. Well, with that last word from a lobbyist who is unashamed to admit it, thank you all very much for coming, and especially to both of our panels, Kathleen and Alex, if you're still here.